Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Glad you're here today. We're going to go ahead and get things started. So I am so glad that you've chosen to join us, whether online or here in person. I'm so thankful that we're getting to continue looking at God's Word together and share a few minutes looking at the context of Christ, considering how looking at the Bible in its context helps kind of bring new elements and bring new ideas and help us to bring clarity, hopefully, in what we're looking at in the text. So I'm so thankful that you are interested in following Christ and learning more about Him. Hey, no worries, no worries. All right. As always, we want to ask the Lord to bless our time together, and we want to have Him to be part of this. So I've asked Mark to go ahead and lead us in a word of prayer. Go ahead.
Our Father in heaven, we are so grateful that you are our Father in heaven. We offer you this morning our praise and worship and adoration because you so much deserve it. And we thank you at this moment for this time to be together, to look into your word, to come to a better understanding of who you are and who we are in your grand plan for this world. So bless this time we have together. Be with Kevin as he speaks to us. Let us all open our ears and hearts and take it in. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thanks, Mark. All right. Well, like I said, I'm glad you're here. We're going to be looking at some things today, but as always, we want to start with our heart verse. So I want to get back to that and practice one more time today. So again, if you're new with us, we're learning a heart verse, the idea of setting things in our heart so that we can know how to please God. And we've been working on Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. All right. If we need a refresher, here it is. All right. Everybody ready? Steady? No. There we go. All right. All right, everybody together. We can do it. I feel it. All right. I'm hearing it. I love it. Yes. All right. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. All right, second chunk. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. All right. I'm hearing it more and more. I'm hearing more and more voices. I hope that that's beginning to settle in your hearts. Lord willing, my plan is next week, we're going to talk about the context of our heart verse. Or 2 weeks, excuse me. So 2 weeks, not next week, 2 weeks. So we're going to be looking at Galatians eventually, a little bit, and just seeing how this verse fits in the greater context. But keep working on it, because I want to be able to have a meditation on it and think about this verse that we've been learning within the context of Galatians. That'll be in 2 weeks, so Lord willing, keep looking at it, get it memorized. We'll keep going, okay? All right, to start with, we're going to be back in Corinth today. So if you got a Bible, we're going to be in Acts chapter 18. And I also want to start with anything from last week, questions, comments, concerns from our time hanging out with the games. I know today's the final day, right, for the Olympics. They're finally closing up shop. They're turning off the fire. But questions about our discussion last week and seeing how the games of isthmia, and hopefully we can still pronounce this lovely word, isthmia, and be able to look at those metaphors of running the race and fighting the fight and winning the crown. Other thoughts, comments? Again, we closed out as always, just as time was ending. So is there anything else that y'all wanted to comment or questions about what we looked at last week? So if you raise your hand, get my attention some way, I'm happy to share the microphone. Okay, I'm not seeing hands, I don't think. Okay, well, then let's go on to today. I think there's some really cool stuff. We're going to do a little bit different today. we're going to get to know the city of Corinth a little bit. So hope you brought your walking shoes today. We're going to travel all around the city of Corinth, all right? So hope you guys ready to trek around a little bit. I want to give you just a basic intro to the city of Corinth. As you can see on the map there, it's located in what's today the country of what? Greece, exactly. It's in the middle of Greece, and it would have been in the heart of Greece, even in the ancient times of the different Greek-speaking people. And so it's there, as we saw last week, on the isthmus. And we looked last week at the city of Isthmia, and that's based upon that little stretch of land. That's that little land bridge there between the main part of Greece and what's called the Peloponnese. That little other part that hangs out down below, that's the Peloponnese. And the part there in the middle is the isthmus. And so it's hanging out there, and we're going to find that's going to be a really important piece. As we say there, it's about 50 miles from Athens. So it's like to drive from Corinth to Athens is about like from driving here to the Woodlands. So that gives you perspective. So we're talking about 50 miles in driving between those two cities. In Corinth, some interesting features as you get there is it was a crossroads. And I think we want to make sure we hang on to that reality. We'll talk more about it. But Corinth was a crossroads. It's where goods and services and people all were going in different directions. For instance, east-west, you're going to be cruising this one little isthmus. That's the only way you get out to the Peloponnese. And Corinth had the corner of the market. Okay, they controlled this area. But there's also other things going on. We have two ports. And that means goods were going from kind of south to north. Basically, if you were taking from my map here, arriving in the port of Cenchrea, and then you would travel, you'd take your stuff up to the city of Corinth, and then you'd do whatever you need to do there. And then if you're sending it on, you send it out of the northern port of Lycia. And from here, it's going to go out the north. And what's the most likely destination of goods going out north and west? Yes, Rome. So basically, goods that are coming from the southeast, like Alexandria and all these things, they'll be passing through Corinth and going to Rome. Because the other option, let me go back to my map here above. It's kind of hard to see here, but if you look on our little map here, if you have a ship coming in from here, you can either drop your stuff off here, cross over into this little area, and then all the way up to Rome, or you have to sail all the way around this Peloponnese right there. And that adds days and days and lots of danger, honestly. So this was an important piece. And because of that, they also, not only did they use the port, they had this thing here, the Canal of Corinth. And now we'll talk about that for just a minute. Here's an image from the ports to give you an idea of distance. Here's the archaeological site, would have been Old City of Corinth, where Paul would have been and so forth. And out here's the port of Lycia. So it's a few miles out north of town. So, but it is, on the outskirts of town. And Cenchrea would have been down here just off the picture. So it also wasn't terribly far, but enough where it's not exactly in town. But they also had another thing. What was called the diolkos. The diolkos was essentially a path that's about, as you can see the width there, and it had stones. And so it was located, the diolkos was located, we go back, wrong way. The diolkos is located here along the narrowest area between the two gulfs. And the diolkos was, come back, just a path with rocks. And what they would do is they would arrive on the south side, for instance, of the diolkos, and they would have a boat. And they'd take all the stuff off the boat, put it on some things, and they would drag it all the way to the other side, take it all off, put it on a different ship, and then send that ship on to Rome. Every single day. If it was a relatively small ship, they wouldn't take anything off. What would they do? They'd take the ship, stick it up on some stuff, and drag it all the way across the diolkos. Day after day after day. Because that was a lot cheaper and a lot faster than sailing all the way around the Peloponnese. But the good thing for the Corinthians is, you know what? Every time someone passed over the diolkos, what are they getting? Cold, hard cash. It's like going on the loop, on the beltway, right? When we're buzzing through and our little lights flash, right? The Texas Department of Transportation's going, cha-ching, right? Every time someone crossed the Diolkos, cha-ching, they were making money. So this is an important crossroads of goods resulting in lots of money. So this is an interesting place. I stood there one time a number of years ago, and it's a really amazing place. Thinking about dragging these ships across day after day is tremendous to me. Well, later on, they created, if you go to Greece now, you can see there's a lovely canal where you can just take your little boat across. It's not very wide. It's not a very big canal, but it's a canal. It was not built until 1893 because they needed one important ingredient to be able to get through: dynamite. Because it's all rock. There was multiple attempts to create a canal, but it was just so hard rock, they couldn't do it. In fact, in the year 67, Nero, the Emperor Nero, tried to create this canal. And what's interesting is this is in the middle or the beginning of the Jewish wars in Jerusalem. You know, that ends in the fall of Jerusalem and everything. Well, in some of the early battles, they took captive a whole bunch of Jewish slaves, sent them to Corinth and said, "Get with the digging, fellas." And there was no way. There were 6,000 Jewish slaves that were brought in to work on this thing, and they couldn't do it. It's just hard rock. And so they couldn't do it. So they had to keep using the Diolkos. And it was the Diolkos, just the dragging across, was used until like the 8th or 9th century AD. That was the way. So anyway, this gives you an illustration of the fact that it's a crossroads. It's going to be very important. All right, cruising along. Now, so if you want to, you can take a ship and drive through the lovely canal since 1893. All right, so that's some of the little bit about Corinth. We're going to come back to the city in just a moment. But I wanted us to settle us again in the literary context. We've talked about historical context as what's going on in the world around you, and the location, the geography, all these pieces. The literary context, again, to remind ourselves, is what's going on in the book. As we're reading a book, how this fits within the greater context within the book itself. Well, we know our main thing from Acts. Jesus told the apostles, "Go be my witnesses here in Jerusalem, in where else? Judea and Samaria, and then finally to the ends of the earth." Well, we are in the ends of the earth as we reach to the city of Corinth. So, as we said, last couple of weeks we've studied about other locations, part of the second missionary journey. And that's so Paul has left the city of Antioch, and he's going through parts of Europe, including Philippi. He's going to go through Thessalonica, down to Athens, and then he's going to cross over into the city of Corinth. And that's where we find ourselves in Acts chapter 18. So that gives us a bit of a context. If you read Acts 18 this last week, you'll see that he had a dream. And God said, "Hey, hang tight here." Why? You might remember why what the dream told Paul? "Stay here because I have many people in this city." And I have to think that would have been comforting to Paul. He'd been run out about every city up to this point. That would get awfully tiresome and scary. He'd been stoned a time before and been just mistreated and had to leave at night. All kinds of stuff. So Paul receives this vision from the Lord, and he tells him, "Look, stay here." And he got to stay there for a year and a half to 2 years that we looked at with the Isthmian Games last week. So that's a bit of our background. I want to take us now on a brief tour, okay? I know this it's not Bible so much, but it gives us an idea of a visual of the city of Corinth. They've done a really good job there in Greece in restoring this particular archaeological site, and we have a good visual of it. So this is a map of what the city would have looked like looking from above. If you're looking here, this is the north, looking out this direction towards the bottom right-hand side of the corner. Oop. I think he's moving. And so we're going to see the main part here. This is the plaza or the agora. This is the main center of town. And then you're going to have this temple is kind of the iconic temple of Corinth probably to Apollo. And then you're going to have up here another temple related to one of the emperors. And you also have another emperor thing here, the the Basilica for Julia. And then you're going to have an important road we're going to see here momentarily that goes out to the northern port. And then over here, we're going to finalize our trip and walking around town by going to the theater. So everybody likes to go to the theater at night, so we'll wait to the end for our tour of that. Okay. All right, so with that in mind, this is looking at what it looks like today. It's kind of hard to see on this map, but here's the temple to Apollo. Here's the forum. We're looking at the opposite side. And so you have some things will go on. All right, this is looking at it, and you see up here the port of Lycaon. You can kind of get a distance of, here's the downtown area. And just you can see how far it is. It's a walking distance, but it's a couple of miles. So you can do it each day if you were working there in the port. And that would be going out on the north side. And it's about the same distance to the Cenchrea port on the south. All right, and this is a picture of the Corinthian temple of Apollo. And so this is one of the few old buildings in the town. And we'll come back to that in a minute. This was a Greek temple that was dedicated most likely to the god Apollo. And so it's still got the 7 pillars. And again, if you ever see any pictures of Corinth now, this is kind of like this is the signature temple that's seen. It would have been at the heart of the Greek and Roman worship for many, many centuries. And that's located there in the middle where the red box is at. So it's kind of right smack dab in the middle of the town. And this is looking the opposite direction, so you can see what's called the Acrocorinth. So we know about the Acropolis in Athens, There's an Acropolis in Athens. Well, there's an Acropolis also in Corinth, and it's this big, tall mountain there in the background. That's called the Acrocorinth. It's a high spot, and that's where if things go wrong, you retreat back up to that spot. And so there's like different layers of protection as if you're being attacked from without. So that's there in the background. We'll come back to that in a minute. All right, so this is another picture of it with some interesting, beautiful things in the background. All right, moving on. This is the plaza, as I mentioned earlier. This is going to be the center of town. This is where all the conversations happen. There's going to be businesses. You go to the market there. This is going to be the ins and outs of where town actually takes place. And this is what it looks like, again, in the archaeological site. This is going to really reflect where Paul would have been. And this is actual first century stuff. So this was not built in 3rd or 4th or 6th or 8th century. It was built in the time just before Paul and would have been during the time that Paul would have been there. And so this is, again, it's hard to kind of picture it here, but on this side, for instance, you're looking, there's the temple that I just mentioned, that's for Apollo. So just in front of it, you have this line of stores. You can barely see it, but there's a whole bunch of stores here that would have been selling all kinds of stuff. It's just a market, like normal things you think of downtown, going to the mall, And on the flip side here, looking the opposite direction, this little building here gives you an idea of what it would have, these been little small places to sell different items. Interestingly enough, they've done some research in the last few years that they found that in the later times, way after the New Testament, I think it's 6th to 8th or 9th century, that this was turned into a little prison. So there's some stuff sketched in the ground where prisoners wrote, hey, God such and so, please attack such and so who put me in here. It's all kinds of, it's some interesting inscriptions. But they discovered this was used as a small little prison for people. Anyway, but this was before that, so it would have been simply a marketplace. But what's interesting, and this one we're going to come back to it later, but look at the proximity. You have the temple here, and just at the edge, you have this market. Put that in your brains. We're going to come back to it. On the opposite side, you had more stuff. So again, if you need to go get some beans to eat, if you need to go get some more clothes or this or that, or selling people as they would do so often in the city of Corinth, this is where you would be going. If there was anything going on politically in your town, this is where you would go, as you'd go to the plaza or the agora. All right. An important piece also in the middle of the agora was the bema, the B-E-M-A. We've come across a bema or bema in another town, right? In the city of Philippi. Paul was taken before the bema in Philippi. It's the place where judgment takes place. This is a judgment seat. We're going to come back to this one in a couple of weeks, Lord willing. But this is an important place where Paul would have stood probably right here. Like most likely he would have been standing about where this little pillar is. And that's, very likely where he would have been in Acts 18. As I mentioned, there's a temple that was to Octavia, and she was a relative of Julius Caesar and his lineage. And so at one end of your main city square, there's a temple dedicated to a member of the family of the Julians. Again, to remind you, who's in charge? And on the other side is another important building that we're not going to take a look at, but here on this end, here's the Temple of Julia, or of Octavia, excuse me. And on this end again is the Julian Basilica. Again, reminding everybody, who is in charge? Rome's in charge. And this is something that always goes back to reminding about power, authority, and who's in control. Who's the king? Well, we got people on both ends of our downtown telling us who's in charge. Here in the red box, we have what's the Lachaean Road. This is a road that goes out to the port. So this is going to have a whole bunch of shops because, like I said, goods are coming in from the port, and you drive it into town, and you just sell it off there as you're walking into town. And it was kind of like downtown, if you think about a street that's like Fifth Avenue, you got stuff coming in and out, and it's all kinds of stuff. I know it's hard to see sometimes with these archaeological sites, but if you can just imagine in your mind's eye, on both sides of the road, just all kinds of places where people are selling all kinds of goods and things, and this would have been where it would have taken place. All right, at the end of the Lachaean Road there in the red box was a very important thing. It is the Corinthian fountain of Pyrene. Pyrene that's where they got their water. This is the water source, and this is why there was a town there. As you well know, water's a little important, right? Having fresh water is a reason why usually cities were established in particular locations. They depended upon water. And so this fountain was an important fountain that was well known. In fact, there's an interesting myth for those of you guys that like Greek and Roman myth. This is where Bellerophon, I think I'm saying that right correctly, tamed the famous Pegasus. So Pegasus was drinking the water, and he came out and roped it up and started riding it. So if you want history or myth, that's part of what took place here in this particular fountain. But this is where everybody would go and hang out, talk, catch up on the stuff that's going on around town, and get your water. Another picture of it from the other side. It was quite an elaborate building by the first century, but very important. So as we continue walking around town, we're not hitting everything, but there's some other buildings here on both sides that they would have been selling stuff. This great big temple complex. There was other temples along here as well that are not mentioned, that I didn't mention today, but that are there as well. And we're going to see later on there's some other stuff that's off the screen that would have been dedicated to the god Asclepius, and we'll look at Asclepius down the road. But let's finish off here in this little place here, going to the theater. Well, before I go there, you can see another little theater here. This is called an Odeon, and it's like a small theater. And it was used more for singing and instruments and that sort of thing, where the larger theater had been where people would have done acting, and the typical Roman or Greek plays and stuff would have been taking place there. So we're going to be hanging out in the theater for just a moment. This is what it looks like now. So you can kind of see the background. That would have been where the people would have been seated. And again, it's hard to see it sometimes, but if you're looking there, the expanse would have been all the seating where people would have sat and watched. You're standing like on the stage from this perspective. You'd be on the stage basically here on the right and looking forward here to all the people sitting in the stands. So that's what some pieces are there. I don't know, question. I kind of went over that fast just to kind of give you an idea, but hopefully that helps us visualize what Corinth would have looked like. Questions on that really fast before we move forward. Again, I know it's kind of random things, but questions? If you have it, say it out real loud and I'll answer it as best I can. Okay, then let's talk a little bit about history of Corinth. What took place in this town? Well, it's got a long history, honestly, so we're going to go really fast and just hit the major highlights. Corinth was a big city in a sense of importance. Okay, it was a very important city. It was founded about 1000 BC, and so it had been around a very long time. And it was kind of something people had been living there since 1000 BC. That was during the classical time when Athens was a major player, and Sparta and all these major other pieces. Well, Corinth was another major player in that conversation. They were an important city in the 5th, 4th, 3rd century BC. And so it was an important, what's called a polis. That's the word for city in Greek, a polis. And that was also the name for, they were like city-states. So we don't think of Greece like a country in the ancient time. They didn't think of it that way. They thought of it, hey, I am from Athens. I am from Corinth. Or I am from, these city-states. That's would have been where the loyalty would have been. Kind of like I know, here in Texas we get that, right? So I'm a Texan, right? So that would have been more than, I'm from the U.S., but, I'm Texan, really, or I'm from Tennessee or whatever. That was that kind of thinking. So they would have been thinking of city-states, and Corinth would have been a major, important city-state for many, many centuries. And then something really important happened. In the year 146 BC, the Romans come to town, led by this fellow, Lucius Mummius Achaeus. He liked to wrap things up. Okay, no one got that joke. I'm sorry. That was a groaner. Sorry. I worked on that all week, even to the delivery, and it didn't go. Okay, I'll have to keep working on my jokes. All right. So Lucius Mummius, if you didn't catch it the first time, Mummius wraps things up. They went in and absolutely, completely demolished the city of Corinth. Just kind of raked it. The only thing that survived was that temple that I talked about earlier for Apollo. They apparently let it stand. Every other building was completely demolished. And so all that we saw on the screen so far of the city of Corinth was Roman rather than Greek. So it's going to be a change. And we're going to have to talk about that in just a minute. So this was really important. So it was absolutely destroyed and kind of left for about 100 years. That nothing was done. Mummius wiped it out whenever the Romans were conquering all of the Greek areas. And then, finally, in 44 BC, just a little before the Ides of March. Just a little before the Ides of March, this fellow named Julius Caesar goes in and says, okay, we're going to rebuild Corinth, because they recognize it's money-making place. We got to control. That's an important choke point. And so Julius Caesar ends up reestablishing the city of Corinth as a colony. And as we looked at before in Philippi, that's an important connection with the city of Rome. And so he's going to establish it. As you can see there, some different people. He's going to send Roman veterans, freedmen, and freedmen was kind of a status, a particular people who had been freed, but it's their first generation. Like if I were a slave to someone and they freed me, I get citizenship from this other citizen. But I'm in a particular social status. I can't do certain things, and there's just some things that get tied along with that. But also some people there from businessmen from Rome called negotiatores, and you have Roman people coming in to settle. There's some Greeks living there around, obviously still, but the population becomes more Roman. And they mix some with the Greek people, but primarily it's a Roman colony. So with that in mind, we have Paul visiting Corinth. That was a very Roman city. Even though it's in the country, what we would call Greece, it was Roman. And that's an important thing to remember as we move forward. All right, the things I've heard all my life, and this is something that's in the last 5 or 10 years that I've stumbled across and realized that I missed something. And I had to update my brain a little bit. You ever have that? Have to update your brain? Have to take an update, and correct some stuff. Well, there was an author named Strabo who wrote there in actually the first century BC. And he talked about that there was 1,000 prostitutes of the goddess Aphrodite that lived up on the Acro Corinth, that tall mountain that was in the background. There was a temple up there, and we know that. There's still remains of that. But according to Strabo, there was 1,000 prostitutes that lived up there and that would serve the people, and serve in that particular temple. And so many theologians and preachers have often said, hey, that tells us what Corinth was like, right? You got 1,000 prostitutes coming downtown every day. They'll go down and do their stuff and then go back up, back to their temple. At the same time, we have another guy, Aristophanes. If you know who Aristophanes was, he was a playwright in Athens in the 4th century, 400s BC. And he also spoke very, very poorly of Corinth as this wild, horrible, just ungodly place. You can never go there, right? It's just terrible. You have to remember, Athens and Corinth were at war. How do you talk about your enemies? Yeah, you deride them, right? So it's got it within a context. They used a word, Corinthiazo or Corinthina, as a Corinthian woman. We know what that is, right? That's just a woman of ill repute, or however you want to say it, right? They would use that to deride women that were supposedly from Corinth, saying how poor morals they were, and all these things I've heard. This description of Corinth was Greek Corinth that was completely and utterly destroyed in 146 BC by Mummius. So all this description of what Corinth would have been like in these sources is anachronous. It doesn't fit the right time. So our description, our thought of, wow, this was this horrifically, unbelievably, amazingly, sensual, terrible city, because Strabo tells us that, well, that's talking about Corinth 500 years beforehand. It reminded me of here's the Corinth, if you can see there on the top here, this would have been where the temple of Aphrodite would have been. Here's another picture to give you an idea. Here on the very tippy top, and to get there, it's like I think a 2 or 3 mile walk uphill. Yeah, that's a long hike. That's not so much fun. To give you an idea of how this is working in my brain, this picture is of Bethany and me when we were back, I think it was 2018.
Mexico City?
In Mexico City, yes. So this is taken from the top of a tower in Mexico City. Why on earth am I mentioning this? You're going, Kevin, you're totally lost us now. I have no idea why are we were in Corinth, now you're taking us to Mexico.
Uh-oh.
There's an important correlation. If I were to describe the city of Mexico City and told you, hey, anybody, if you got flight down to Mexico City, you land. You're going to land, and you know what? The whole city is full of these islands, and you go from island to island to get to the different places of town. And there's all these Aztec warriors running around. Be careful, don't let them kill you, because there's Aztecs all over the place. If I told you that as you fly into Mexico City, what would you think about that? You would say, Kevin, you are crazy. There's no Aztecs running around Mexico City. What are you talking about? Well, there were. It was the city of Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was the capital of the Aztec Empire 500 years ago. And it was a city built upon a whole bunch of little islands. It's a fabulous story. Check it out. It's really cool. But in the city of Tenochtitlan, it was all these little islands, the whole thing, and that's how they lived. It was amazing. In the middle of a lake. If you go to Mexico City now, you're not going to see a lake all around the city. You're going to see this ginormous town, what you can see there in the picture. And the way in which we're looking at Corinth correlates with this. When we describe Corinth, and I've heard it described this way from a lot of sermons, is Greek Corinth from the 4th century BC, rather than 1st century Roman Corinth that we're looking at in the time of Paul. So it's about being precise. It's about being careful in our study and seeing data that's accurate. So I want to challenge us to think well as we're doing research. So, for instance, another parallel is the city of Nineveh. Nineveh is in kind of Iran today, and Nineveh would have been a city that was very well known in the ancient world. And so what's interesting, we have 2 prophets in the Old Testament that talk about the city of Nineveh. One is our friend Jonah, right? Jonah, such a great guy, makes great movies, all that kind of stuff. Jonah goes to Nineveh. And what's the outcome? He goes around town, 40 days, you're done, right? And then what happens? The people repent and they change. And God says, okay. And then in a little while later, another prophet named Nahum, he also talks about the city of Nineveh. He's going, you know what, guys, y'all are done. And if you're reading this from our vantage point 2,000 years later, you go, what's going on here? Well, look at the difference. Jonah was in that like 200 years before Nahum, just about. And so as we're reading the book of Jonah, that's at one very different period of time than when you're reading Nahum. Entirely different generations are living. Have things changed in the United States in 200 years? We were barely a country, right? So again, it's about being careful. And I want to encourage us as we think about figuring out context to look carefully at context. Chronologically as well as important as location and other things. So just as a word of caution, as we study this, think about within their context. All right, we got to keep rocking. I'll never get through. So what was the city of Corinth in the time of Paul? How was it? Well, we know for sure that it was a port city on the crossroads where lots of money was flowing through. We know there were slave trading, a lot going on in the city of Corinth. We have archaeological evidence, literary evidence that supports that reality. So you have this huge flow of people, of goods, money, all this stuff was taking place, east, west, north, south. There's a lot of things going on. So also a lot of movement of ideas. A lot of ideas were passing through the city too. So you think this is a good place for Paul to come hang out? Man, what a great place. You got people coming in and out all the time. What a perfect place to evangelize. You've got people from all over the world coming through here of all stripes. And you have a great opportunity to share the gospel with them. And then they can take it wherever they go next. God is so smart. It's amazing, isn't it? God used Paul powerfully in that. Also, it was a Roman garrison was there. There was a military presence. So that also impacts some elements of how this would feel. It did have the typical Roman vices. So let me be clear. As we talked about the whole 1,000 prostitutes and so forth from Strabo before, I don't think that was necessarily what was going on in the first century. But let me tell you, if you know anything about Rome, man, it had all kinds of vices. You know, that was very common to have connections with prostitutes as well as all kinds of other horrible things that they were practicing in the way they treated people. Like I said, slavery and drinking parties and all kinds of stuff. There was just all kinds of things, right? Their world was broken. And we're going to talk about that, Lord willing, next week. Yes, Corinth was in a very broken city. They had lots of issues, even if it doesn't quite fit our 1,000 prostitute thing, right? But it was a very broken city. If you've ever lived in a port town, right? Like if you ever go to a military town, oftentimes there's some challenges with that, isn't there? And there's nothing uncommon here in the city of Corinth as well. It also had, of course, the connection with all of the typical Greco-Roman gods. So if you're an evangelist, you're talking about the things that people typically believed in the Greco-Roman world of Apollo and Zeus and Hermes and all these different gods and all the implications of their lives. So Paul is also dealing with, as I said earlier, connections to the imperial cult, the idea that the Roman emperor was a divine after he died, typically. And so therefore, you are better be doing allegiance to this emperor. And so, like I said, at both ends of the plaza, you had a reminder who's in charge. And here comes Paul come along. Hey, let me tell you about this new king that's out there. His name's Jesus. How is that going to fly in the middle of the city of Corinth? You've already got a king, right? If you're a Corinthian, he's back in Rome. And you better not forget it. And so that's another piece that's coming into this conversation. Paul's declaring a different king. Another piece. All right. We read this last week, and I want to look briefly at the text, and then I want to make some conclusions here. As we look at this passage, Paul gets to the city of Corinth. We looked last week at he meets up with Priscilla and Aquila in the first 3 verses, and then later on, he starts teaching in the synagogue, and I'll let you kind of just read it. He arrives at the synagogue, preached there for a few weeks, and then eventually, he has some success. They start becoming believers and followers of Jesus. And a couple of people take on, and particularly the synagogue leader, which is a pretty big deal, as well as this guy Crispus, and we know from the books of Corinth that others as well. So this is Paul's first contact. He goes in, he stays there for about 2 years teaching them and helping them develop and grow. He had some serious investment in this early group of believers in Corinth. And as we move forward, what's interesting, I think we have an interesting example of disciple making. Paul got the idea of we need to be making disciples. So he spent a year and a half there training, developing, helping them grow and mature and know about Jesus. Well, we also find later on, Paul writes what's called the lost letter. If you look in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he had written something and said, hey, don't do certain things. He'd already written them a letter. We don't have this letter. Okay, it's gone. So it's been lost to time. We've never seen it. Paul then writes 1 Corinthians from Ephesus. So if you keep looking at your Bibles, if you get over in chapter 19, Acts 19, Paul is hanging out in the city of Ephesus, and he writes back to the place he had just lived in Corinth and writes what we call 1 Corinthians. Okay, so that's what I'm calling Corinthians B there, because we have extra letters we're going to find. Later on, Paul makes what's called the painful visit. That's mentioned in 2 Corinthians. He said, I went and I made this painful visit. What happens is when Paul's over here in Acts 19, hanging out in Ephesus, teaching and preaching there for a couple of years, he makes a trip back to Corinth and talks with them, and then goes back to Ephesus. It's not mentioned in the book of Acts. Okay, it's not mentioned. We have to define that from other letters. But that's what took place. Some folks from Chloe's household came over and told him. And so he makes this painful visit. Then he writes what I'm calling Corinthians C. And that was another difficult letter that's mentioned at the beginning of 2 Corinthians. He said, I'm not going to go back one more time. I'm just going to send this letter. So he sends Corinthians C. Well, then Paul leaves Ephesus in Acts chapter 20, and he starts traveling back north. He goes probably to Philippi in that area, Thessalonica, and he sends Titus, his buddy. Titus was a great guy. I can't wait to get home and meet him. He's a good guy. Anybody that was sent to the mess that was in Corinth to go fix that, man, he's a good dude. And so Titus goes, and Paul says, go check on him. I'm worried about him. So Titus goes, and then he finally comes back and meets Paul there in the area of Macedonia. Titus arrives with good news. That's mentioned in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5. And so Paul finally writes what we call 2 Corinthians. And so we have this letter, and that's 2 Corinthians talking about what took place from there. And finally, Paul visits Corinth yet one more time, a third visit in Acts chapter 20 when he spends the winter there. And that's what we know between the correspondence between Paul and the city of Corinth. It's interesting, isn't it? When you start putting it all together and seeing it in one big place, Paul spent a lot of time, energy, sweat, blood, and tears helping these people develop. And this doesn't even take into consideration what he talks about in 1 Corinthians, where I planted, and what else? Apollos watered, right? So this doesn't even count Apollos. And there's also Cephas that they mention there, that some of the divisions. So Paul, apparently Peter or something was involved there. So we have other people also involved in the development. And Priscilla and Aquila certainly made an impact. There was a lot of disciple making, training, developing over a long time. It's an interesting thing, I think. For me, this was helpful to kind of finally get, how did Paul engage this church of Corinth? He engaged a lot. It was hard. So with that in mind, I want to talk about one person. And we have like 3 minutes left, but I think this is just really cool. There's a guy by the name of Erastus. You've probably never heard of him. He's not really well known in the New Testament, but it's just really, really cool. And I think he illustrates the complexity of living in Corinth as a believer. You don't have any empire-wide persecution that's really clear or explicit until Diocletian in the 3rd century. So that's something that I think of a bit of a myth on, that there was this constant persecution from Rome all the time. We don't have evidence of that. There's a little bit in 64 with Emperor Nero in Rome, but we don't know how much that influenced the rest of the empire, so we just don't know. We have nothing that's later on in the 1st century that maybe some stuff are going on, but until Diocletian, we don't really know of empire-wide trying to stamp out the church movement. But there were certain sporadic individual areas in which things took place, like in the first part of the 2nd century, that we know from a guy by the name of Pliny. But there was always, and this is the piece I want to make mention of briefly, there was always social pressure going on. You had to decide who your king was, and that impacted every single relationship you had. If you had a patron that's taking care of you and he wasn't a believer and you decide to become a believer, you may have just cut off your purse strings. You got to start over again. And that's some serious business. What about your family members that are not believers? And your whole community is going to be against you because you're not doing what's right with the gods. And if you bring the wrath of the gods on us, buddy, for not following them all, not good. So there's all kinds of elements, a lot of social pressure to fall in line with all the other typical things. So you're constantly being pressured with this. Imagine living in that context where every single facet of your life was impacted by the decision to follow this guy, Jesus. Well, Erastus was one who decided to follow Jesus. We have him mentioned at the end of the book of Acts, chapter 16. Erastus, who is the city's director of public works, called the Economos, our brother Quartus sends you, just to send it. It's at the very end of Romans 16 that everybody skips because it's just a bunch of names, right? He's mentioned there. Later on, in Acts 19, he sent two helpers, Timothy and Erastus, to Macedonia while he stayed in province of Asia a little while longer, talking about Paul. Again, in 2 Timothy 4, we find Erastus popping up once again. Erastus stayed in Corinth, and I left Trophimus sick in Miletus. This is the end of Paul's life in the mid-60s probably. So Erastus keeps bumping along. We see him coming up, but that's all we have in the Bible about Erastus. That's it. So we don't know much about him from the text. However, something really cool. Coming back to our Romans 16, mentions that he was the oikonomos. That's the Greek term that's related to that's the parallel of a Roman title called the aedile, is how we typically say it in English, aedile. This was the guy that was in charge of all of the festivals of the city. This was an important dude. He was a guy that was really up in the government of the city of Corinth. And one of his jobs was making sure all of the temples were taken care of. You're a believer in Jesus. How does that work? You've got to be in charge of all these pagan temples and make sure that they're taken care of as a believer in Jesus? How are you going to navigate that? That's complicated, isn't it? Guys, we face some things just like them, don't we? We have things in our world that are going, how do we navigate being a believer in Jesus and walk in this world that's so messed up? It's not new. Erastus had to figure it out. All right, I got just seconds, so we got to get back. All right, our tour ended in the theater. And in the theater, there's something really cool that we found archaeologically there. It's this pavement. It's right in front of the theater. This pavement says that's what's there on the second line. Erastus, for the office of aedile, laid this pavement at his own expense. This is our Erasmus, people. This is it. We have archaeological evidence showing the guy that's in the New Testament running for aedile. Isn't that cool? Guys, this is real. We're not making this up. And we know that poor Erastus had to figure out how to navigate life. So, as we close up our time, let's take care of how we look interpretation, like we looked at. Let's make disciples to keep growing over a long period of time. And guys, let's keep being as wise as we can as we all navigate our different worlds and the complexities that we run into. So, I think they're about to run me out. But I want to give us an encouragement for next week. As we start exploring for next week, keep working on Galatians 2. And I want to encourage you to read 1 Corinthians chapter 6. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. We're going to be talking about the brokenness in the city of Corinth, which in many ways mirrors the brokenness of our poor world. So read 1 Corinthians chapter 6 next week, and we'll talk about more of the city of Corinth. Guys, have a great week. God bless. We'll see you then.